and welcome back, everybody, to the Beer Ladies podcast. I am playing host today. My name is Thandi, and I am joined by my wonderful friends, Christina and Erica. And today we are talking, I think we're in our last installment now of our spooky season episodes, and we're talking about magical brews and might touch on a little bit of medicine, but what we're really wanting to talk about is how beer has played a role in things like witchcraft, things like ritual, and throughout history. You know, what do we know about beer and its magical properties, if anything? So before we get into that, let me just remind you all, please, to continue to like and subscribe and follow and share and hit us up on the socials. We're at Beer Ladies Pod on most places, including Instagram, by the way. We've matched our two handles. So we're at Beer Ladies Pod on Instagram and Twitter. We're at Beer Ladies Podcast on Facebook, and we're at beerladiespodcast@gmail.com and beerladiespodcast.com if you'd like to go and see the website, which is very nearly up to date. Right. So, ladies, let's, before we get into sort of spooky season magical brews, how about we go through what are we drinking this evening? So, Erica, let's start with you. What have you got today?
Yeah, today I have a beer by Wide Street. They're from County Longford here in Ireland, and it's called Lapse. It's the third in this series. I've had the spring and summer ones, and this is the autumn edition. It's an Altbier, and it describes this as a style originating in Dusseldorf with a dark amber color and medium to assertive bitterness balanced out with a malty backbone. And I'm really enjoying it so far, and I really like the fall colors on the can.
I am actually so impressed because the fall colors on the can match your beautiful headphones. I don't know how you got that right, but I think you've got rainbow headphones, but they're gorgeous, and it matches the colors of the can there. Very nice. Nice to see an Altbier. You don't see many of them, actually. Yeah. Christina, friend, what you got?
I'm drinking a Heaney, New England IPA. It says hops or haze, hops, and juice, which is exactly what it does. That's exactly what it says on the tin. I like Heaney Brewery. I like their beers. I don't think I've ever had a bad one from them, and it does exactly like the rest of them. It's quite a I mean, I like New England IPAs. Like, I'm definitely like, an East Coast IPA kind of girl. I mean, I do drink West Coast in the odd time, but I really am enjoying this one. Thank you.
Sounds delicious. All right, and myself, I've got a Cold Dark Heart by O'Shea's. Oh, I've got some blurring issues here from O'Shea's, and this is one of those that you get at Aldi's. And it's an Irish stout, 4.5%, so brewed here in Ireland, and it's delicious. It's really well priced. It's very nicely brewed, so absolutely no complaints. None here anyway. All right, let's try and set the scene, set the context for magical brews. Christina, I think let's go to you. Let's see what we've got.
Yeah, so we've sort of touched base on this, like sort of as part of episodes in the past. So now I'm going to kind of summarize, I guess, all of the magical properties of things that we've been talking about in the past, including like beer and its use in like ritual magic. So that's kind of where I'm going to start. And let's start with the Vikings, or let's start with Norway or the Scandinavian countries. So as we talked about in the beer and Vikings episode, beer, or more properly at that time, not necessarily hopped, so ale, played an important role in certain ceremonies. We have the ceremony of freedom ale, we have the idea of inheritance ale, we have these sorts of things. So inheritance ale, if I'm reminding you, is the ale that was brewed for the funeral feast. So when someone died, their heirs or their children, same thing really, depending on the person, would brew this ale in their honor, and it was drank at their funeral feast as part of the process of inheritance. So there's this concept of the bragaful, which is sort of the toast to the dead, but also the actual cup in which the ale was held. And this was passed around, and people said all these things until the inheritor sort of sat down and then took over this process. Like, this is now their property. And we've kind of talked about that. So in sort of thinking about spooky season, I have a kind of spooky season example of this, and I talk about this in my book. So this comes from like a Viking saga, a Brygge saga. And in this one, a ship goes down, right? It just goes down and everyone dies. They all drown. All of these men, they just drown, and it's really, really sad. And so they're gathering to organize the inheritance feast, the funeral feast. They're brewing the ale, they're doing the things that they have to do. And problems arise when the dead come to drink their own burial ale at their funeral feast. And so we have, in this case, I don't really want to call them ghosts because they're physical people. They're dripping water. They're walking. They're drowned men. So perhaps closer to zombies than ghosts. And at this is not initially a problem because it's good luck to drink your own burial ale. So everyone is okay with it at first. But the problem is they keep coming back over and over and over again.
Clearly that ale was delicious.
And so, yeah, this creates problems. So that's sort of that story in a nutshell. But we see this sort of also the importance of creating ale. We see it in the concept of making christening beer. So you're creating a beer for a new child or a birthing beer for a new mother. But also, interestingly, I found this letter. Well, I didn't find, someone else found, and then I found their article. This letter between a pope and an archbishop of Norway. And this was from like 1241. And basically, they're writing about using beer in baptism. So there's apparently a lack of water. And so because of this, they're baptizing their children in beer. And they're like, well, really, you need to have water because you need to be reborn in the Holy Spirit, and baptismal rites with beer don't count. But this is not to say that they didn't happen. It does appear that they might have actually occurred from time to time. There's not a lot of evidence, but some. So they are possibly using sort of beer in Christian ritual as well. Now, this might not necessarily have been it was not sanctioned by this letter, but it looks like it could have been used. And this reflects what we saw sort of when we were talking about St. Bridget, because of course she had the beer miracle. Well, she was able to turn, that's just a small amount of malt into all of those, enough ale to serve however many, all those churches, because of the importance of the feast of Easter. So we do sort of see this relationship between beer and magic in Christian ritual, and within Christian saints and their prayers to their gods and the prayers to the Christian God and those sorts of things. So we do see this within the context of Christianity. And it's kind of quite prevalent, actually, particularly in Irish culture. When I was doing research for my book on, of course, Irish beer history, you do see ale kind of talking about a lot. And that could just be because of the ubiquitous of ale, like everybody's just drinking it. So when we're talking about it, it just happens to be what we're talking about. But it's quite common. I think it's really, really interesting.
Can I ask a couple questions, Christina? So I was wondering, with the Viking presence in Ireland, did that tradition trickle down here, or was it mostly in places like Sweden or Denmark or, Finland, that kind?
Did the practice of inheritance ale, was it practiced in Ireland? Yeah. So this is like speculation. So informed speculation. Let's go with that. So as I will argue with my book, I think so initially, because what happens is that the Vikings quickly acculturate into Irish culture. This is kind of probably by proxy the fact that their cultures were really similar. So a lot of their practices are really incredibly similar. And we're going to touch base on this well, I'll just talk about it now. So for example, one of the things that you see in both cultures is the act of women serving ale. And in both cultures, this the woman who serves the ale not only is a high status woman. So it's a woman serving ale to her husband. So say she's an aristocratic woman. She's a high ranking woman, and she's serving her ale to her husband. And basically what part of this practice, what the point of this practice is, when it's a high status woman serving her husband, etc., is that she's reiterating his position in the social hierarchy, and therefore everyone else who's drinking and consuming ale at that place is accepting his position. So it's part of this ritual of establishing and accepting social hierarchy. But with this, Michael Einright argues, and I would agree with him, that this ritual of serving and this aristocratic woman not only serves this in a secular sense, but it's also in a magical or religious sense. And this is, we find this ritual in Irish literary sources and in Viking literary sources, also early medieval English. This is happening all over early medieval Europe. This ritual of serving that's also tied up in perhaps prophecy, perhaps ritual magic, these sorts of things are all there. And it might not be explicitly said that it is ritual magic, but the implication is there. So a lot of these things overlap. So initially when the Vikings come, they are practicing their original traditions and those sorts of things. And we can see that with burial practice and those sorts of things. But over time, they acculturate, which means they adapt to what's happening in Ireland. They're doing what's happening in Ireland and they're adapting their traditions. You know, a lot of them convert to Christianity. Now, whether they're really Christian or they're saying they're Christian for political reasons is something that scholars will probably always argue about. But yeah, so they're kind of adapting to the local culture. But that being said, we do have evidence of funerary feasts, even in Christian Ireland. So it is quite a big funeral feast, massive funeral feast, festivals that started because it was the funeral feast of a daughter of a noble man or a daughter of a king. And so then that started this feast, which became a festival every year, which became et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we do know that funeral feasts are something that overlaps in both cultures.
But then what is the, I guess, the significance of the beer in this, you know, or the ale in this? So what gives it that, let's say, that magical quality, that gives it the magical sort of ritual quality of it, I guess?
Well, yeah, it sort of depends, I guess, what culture. So we'll talk about Vikings. So the process of serving the ale, it's the actual physical ritual of drinking the ale or mead or whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be ale, although it is, when we're talking about like the funeral ale and the inheritance ale, it is very clearly öl, which is ale. So that's really what we're talking about. So the process is, we'll talk about inheritance ale. So we have the thing that's called bragaful. So the bragaful means both the process of toasting the dead person and also the cup. So the cup is passed around and people give toast to the dead person. And then it's given to the inheritor who drinks it. Well, they also drink it as it's passed around and then they drink it. Ale is also present in possibly human sacrifice rituals, so I don't actually trust that as a source for Vikings, though it could absolutely be a source for the people that it's talking about, but I'm not entirely convinced that that's applicable to Norwegian Vikings or Swedish Vikings or things of that nature. And we see ale possibly being used to reach altered states of consciousness as part of ritual practice. And that's something that you can still see now in people who practice ritual magic. It is quite effective. It's definitely a way to reach an altered state of consciousness, which can give you that, you know, possibly that window into, you know, different metaphysical places, much like people would use psychedelics or any other mind altering substances. So
we're not just talking about being a bit buzzed. We're talking about a completely different kind of consciousness.
Well, I mean, like being, you know, you getting to that point. So like, you know, I guess we could compare it to, you know, using psychedelics. If you take psychedelics, you reach this altered state of consciousness. You do the same thing when you smoke weed or when you drink alcohol. You are an altered state of consciousness when you drink. Even if you are a little buzzed, you have altered your state of consciousness. And this sometimes helps people if they want to reach this altered state, to get into a better mindset, to practice perhaps, whatever ritual that they want to, because it perhaps breaks down some barriers. Maybe they put up their own barriers for their own selves, and they want to break that down, make themselves a little more open to an experience, or something like that, cast away maybe some of their skepticism or something like that. But that's more of a modern practice. But yeah, we do see substances being used throughout time to reach altered states of consciousness as part of ritual magic practice.
And with the modern day baptisms and funerals in Ireland, I've noticed something that I didn't see in the US, which is drinking alcohol, and particularly beer. Do you think this custom is kind of a remnant of the time period you referred to earlier?
Very good question. Do I think that modern funeral rituals have, wow, what a good question. Yeah. I think in all of us, all these rituals are couched in history, and they have reiterations over time and over time and over time. I don't think anyone consciously is like, you know what, I'm going to have these beers and stuff because I'm engaging in an inheritance practice or whatever. I think it's more of the ritual of alcohol consumption as a bonding experience, which is somewhat universally culturally understood. And it's a way to let out feelings and engage with each other in this sort of bonding environment, also possibly highly emotionally charged environment, which is, it's cross-cultural. A lot of cultures do that. And even, within the US, I think there are plenty of cultures that would engage in sort of ritual funerary drinking, depending on the culture and what their beliefs are. But yeah, I do absolutely think that this sort of ritual drinking tradition at celebrations and commiserations is a really important part of culture that dates back millennia.
And I was really glad that you mentioned St. Bridget, because she's been in the news recently because Ireland is hoping to add another bank holiday to its calendar. And I believe St. Bridget's Day is one of the top contenders.
Well, yeah,
that would be cool.
That would be really cool. I'm always on team more bank holidays, honestly.
Especially ones that have got a beer sort of laden history. I think that's quite cool.
Yeah.
Well, and like, speaking of, like, St. Patrick himself is also, we also see him like popping up with ale stories. So in one case, in the later medieval period, we see he's visiting a king, and a wizard or a druid adds poison to his ale. And so I'll read you a quote. Patrick is then called to the king's couch that he might eat food. And Patrick refused not that. The wizard put a drop of poison into Patrick's drink, and he gave it into Patrick's hand, but Patrick blessed it, and he inverted the vessel, and the poison fell out. But not even a little bit of ale fell. And so then afterwards, Patrick drank the ale. So we also see magic again in this practice of Christianity, where a Christian saint therefore has prayed to the Christian God, and the Christian God has then blessed this ale, and which results in the poison falling out, but the ale being fine. And so
I'd wonder if the same is true for St. Arnold's. I actually have a kind of ceramic type medal. He's one of the patron saints of beer and brewing, and I'd be curious to do more research into that, because I personally didn't know much about this topic before this episode, so I'm learning lots from you, and didn't know about the threads that were between religion and magic, like Christianity, for example. So
yeah, like there's another Irish saint who comes upon a city and believes that there's the devil in the ale, and then bursts and prays to the Christian God, and the Christian God helps him burst the barrels of ale and drive the devil out. So, like, ale is both a healing medium. It's something good, as we see with St. Bridget, but it also can have poison or the devil. So it's the ale isn't bad, right? It's the thing in the ale that can be bad. And again, this might just be because ale is just ubiquitous and everyone's drinking it, or it could be sort of this other association. But to be very clear, it's not just the Vikings and their, their practices or Christian practices. It's people of all religions that were practicing and have associated magic and beer. We're going to have an episode about Sumerian culture, but Sumerians, for example, they had beer as offerings to goddesses, Kasi, and other goddesses, parts of ritual. Their gods and goddesses brewed, these sorts of things. So we know from there. On the other side of the world, for example, in Peru, we have both the Wari Empire and the Incan Empire, who both had women who brewed chicha, as we talked about in our chicha brewing episode. And this was a high status, potentially high status position. And this ale was used in ritual, and the women themselves potentially lived in or were a very ritually symbolic and important position within their religious practices. So we see that. Going over again, we can see the Zulu goddess of rain, who has the lovely name of Lady Rainbow. And we talked about her in our goddesses, our beer gods and goddesses episode. And she's accredited with teaching the Zulu women how to brew. And there's lots of ceremonies associated with bringing her beer or brewing beer by women. And I can list a lot more. So I'm happy to take questions, or if anyone has questions about that, get at me on brachiotrix and stuff like that. But yeah, this is not just a Christian or European or even pagan European thing. This is cross-cultural, that we see ale associated with magic practice, religious practice, and ritual practice.
Do you think it's because let's say for many, many years before people really understood the science behind beer, but do you think it had something to do with people seeing, something come out as more of the sum of its parts, and that, it seemed magic because they didn't know how it came about necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see like fermentation is treated as a bit of like, oh, what is this? It's a bit, they're not entirely sure what it is. So for example, back into the Vikings, we have an example of two women who are brewing, right? So this guy goes out, he's married already. He has a wife, he's married. He goes out, he sees another woman. He wants to marry her too. He wants to have two wives. And his first wife is like, no, I'm not having this. I'm not doing this. And he's like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. You guys are going to brew against each other. And whoever makes the better beer, that's who I'm going to stay married to. And they're like, okay, cool. So wife number two talks to Odin and says, hey, Odin, can you give blessing to my beer so that way I win? Well, he spits in her ale and then she wins. And there is this idea that perhaps spit was a way that we could have gained yeast in the fermentation process in Viking culture. And this is something that we see with chicha brewing, also with sake brewing. So using spit is probably a way that cultures pre-germ theory, pre-understanding what yeast was, as a way to get their beer fermented. But the whole point of me telling this story was basically to say like, okay, but look at the magic process to be used as part of brewing. So there is this magic that's used in brewing. And I do think that there is probably this association with, well, they don't know exactly what causes it, right? But they do know that it happens. And so, there is probably that, but it's also something that's just so ubiquitous in their culture. And it's such an important part of their culture. It can be quite high status depending on who's brewing it and what they brewed it with. And it can also reach those altered states of consciousness, which are really important for a lot of magic practices around the world. So that's also really important. And also it could be quite nutritional. So it's a really important part of your daily diet. So it's not just something that you drink, but it's also part of your nutrition. It's part of your, your religious rituals. It's part of this and this and this and this. So it becomes a pretty important beverage. It's also something that people, depending on the culture, drank at all levels of society, although maybe different grains were used and things of that nature. So it is a uniting sort of a beverage. It's something that people understand. And I think you still have that now. People understand what beer is. It's not something that is only for certain people. Beer is for everybody. Which I think is wonderful. Now, there's definitely some misogyny and some racism and things like that, which does make it sound like it's just for like white hipster guys, and it's just not. And I think, we're doing really much better as an industry at being like, yeah, beer is for everybody, because it really is for everybody. But yeah, so that was a bit of a tangent. But yeah.
It just shows, I guess, how prominent it was and how normal it was for people at all, let's say, ages, at any stage of life, at any kind of customary event, whether it was a birthday or a funeral or a baptism or you know, anything. It didn't even have to really be a special occasion. It could have just been a Sunday, but it just shows how prominent and how ubiquitous beer has been and ale has been for all of us, really.
Yeah, for forever, you
Yeah.
know,
and for so many different reasons. Yeah.
There's so many different reasons, and they're using it as part of, as part of medicine. And so, for example, we know Hildegarde von Bingen, for example. She wrote a lot of really important texts for modern historians in order to understand potential uses of medicine in the medieval period. And she had a couple of different ways that someone could use ale as part of the medical process. One is lilium is mixed with beer and honey as a tonic for someone with who has been bruised in the chest. In another example, malt was made into cakes, which is also something that we see in early medieval Irish texts and throughout the world, really. And that these should be put into warm water and placed on tumors. Hildegarde also said hops were not much used to humans, except perhaps as a preservative for beverages due to its bitterness. So this is kind of one of the first links we see between, or links possibly between hops and their use, although we do have examples of hops from much earlier times. And so it is quite possible that they were using hops, but that's a tangent for another day. But it is interesting perspective. And we know that they associated medicine with magic. So they're not separate things necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, there's a famous poem, an ode to Rosemary, that's found in the Lost Combe manuscript, which was written between 1375 and 1425 in Hiberno English, which is Irish English, either in Kildare or maybe in the Pale, which is of course the region around Dublin. But it represents a mix of Irish and English traditions. But in any event, this poem lists all the various uses for rosemary and medicine and magic. They're really put together. It's said to be good for all manner of things, including worms, cold, using it in a bath, making yourself prettier, and helping you get married. So we can kind of see that rosemary is used, and this is very much a poem from a Christian tradition. They name Jesus, the Holy Spirit, Mary, these sorts of things. So we really, really do know that this poem is from that tradition. But we do see, these links between medicine and magic, with herbs, or things you can consume, things you can drink, things you can eat. So this is definitely a link. But again, as I said, not just Christian cultures, not just pagan European cultures, but all over the world for millennia, this link has been made, which maybe there's something to it, right? There might be something there that we need to explore, that we need to say, okay, there's this link between beer and magic. Maybe that there is really something to this if all these cultures are saying this. And that's why you see it still used in modern times. There was actually a brew recently, I believe, that was made by people who practice witchcraft, and they used the brew as part of their magical practice, and it was made and blessed and these sorts of things. So it's definitely something that people are still engaging with and still doing now, which I think is really, really cool.
I'd have to find a source for this, but I've got an intuition, or maybe a memory, or maybe I'm making it up, but I have a feeling that in certain cultures down in South Africa, when you're brewing your umqombothi for whatever occasion it might be, but let's call it a funeral in this case, if you're brewing your umqombothi, you often would save some for the ancestors, as a way of helping the passage to heaven or to the afterlife or to the to the spirit realm in some or other way, which is an interesting concept, because it means that you're not just brewing for the people coming. It is there to help and to almost sweet talk the ancestors, or also to thank them. There's a lot of different let's say rituals in the loosest term possible that have to do with ancestors in Africa as opposed to gods. But you know, beer and look, beer isn't always clear sort of hoppy beer like it is in sort of a European centric world, but it's very much made with grains, and it's fermented, and it's a bit sour, and it's actually lovely. But yeah, but it's very, very much part of the culture.
Yeah, and I noticed that in Bolivia as well. I was drinking chicha at several weddings, and you're always meant to pour out some of your chicha onto the ground for Pachamama, which is a sort of Mother Earth. And this is a very like Catholic community that I was attending these weddings in, and they still hold that belief to this day. Yeah.
When you do that, the Vikings as well, you can pour some out for Odin. But even in American culture where I was raised, if someone had died, you'd pour some out for them onto the ground in their memory. And the link between using ancestors and beer as an offering to ancestors is, I mean, again, very cross-cultural. We'll see that with the great ancestress of the Ainu in Japan. They're brewing sacred beer in her honor until it was banned by the government, unfortunately. It was a low alcohol brew, which was said to make the drinkers closer to their ancestors and deities. In ancient Honduras, we see the same thing there, brewing as part of their culture and to their ancestors. In Lithuania, we see the same thing. A part of their ceremonies and religious rituals, beer was poured out in the honor of the goddess of grain. So this is everywhere, which I just think is just so wonderful, really.
I also found a link to traditional Chinese medicine, with hops and barley being seen as healing ingredients in herbal gardens, with hops being treated for insomnia, depressive symptoms, nervous tension and anxiety, and barley acting to detoxify, to strengthen the spleen, and to help the functions of the gallbladder. So yeah, literally worldwide. Yeah. And I mean, I think I and others that I know have definitely used it as a form of stress relief. And I've read that some studies have found that it may be linked to bone growth, helpful for your skin, aiding in better sleep, but acting as a supplement, not as a treatment. So never replacing food with beer, and always drinking in light to moderation consumption. And yeah, I also found it contains antioxidants, phosphorus, calcium, potassium, manganese, fluoride, and silicon. And that was from Healthline, and that was a recent article that I trusted. So, you know, it's something that's still being talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was, look, I had my child like 11 years ago, but even then they were talking about milk stout for your breast milk, you know. Drink a milk stout every day and you'll never struggle with your milk. So, you know, and that's a very, very common thing. And for bone density, that's the other one that I'd heard of, especially milk stouts again. And I guess it's got to do with the lactose or whatever, but stouts, I think, more than other styles, and milk stouts in particular.
And I think here in Ireland as well, like the Guinness had some sort of iron content that they were kind of promoting at some stage that maybe isn't the case anymore.
Guinness for strength.
Well, they used to literally prescribe Guinness to new mothers, like the NHS used to. I mean, this is back in the 19th century, so no one get angry about this, but this was back then, and they would prescribe it to nursing mothers. And then, of course, when we think about the rise of malt tonics and their use at like lifting the spirit and don't be lethargic and these will make you happy and strong and no more headaches. And I mean, they said that they could cure everything, and that might be the ale, and that might be the strychnine, and who really knows about that? But yeah, it's definitely something that we see over and over and over again. But yeah, Eric, I think you touched on something really important, is that we use ale now as a ritual process of relaxing, and we will not sit there and be like, oh, it's a ritual. but like as an archaeologist, I can tell you it's a ritual. If you are drinking ale as part of your bad day, ritual. If you're drinking ale on your Friday as, oh my God, it's the weekend, ritual. If you're meeting up with your friends in pubs because you haven't seen them in a really long time and this is how you all get together, ritual. Christmas parties, ritual. Work dues, ritual. So we're definitely see all these things over and over again. Christmas dinner, ritual. Thanksgiving, ritual. Like these are all, it's all still really important part of our rituals.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't
Really
call them
is.
that anymore.
Yeah, we don't recognize our own rituals as what they are, really. Listen, I still believe that when you've got a cold coming on, you just get the hoppiest IPA you can and you'll be fine in the morning. there it is, Dr. Thandi.
Or hot whiskey.
Or a hot whiskey.
That was not a thing where I was when I was in the States, but like here it's hot whiskey. Cures all your ails. I think for our family it was like flat Coke or flat Sprite or one of the two was supposed to help.
Yeah.
With what ails you. But here it's hot whiskey.
Ails you. That was a good pun, Christina.
Was not intentional.
And I've heard of babies having brandy put on their gums for when they're teething as well. So that hasn't been for
that's
decades.
A thing.
But...
Yeah, that's
a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a thing. I suppose it's a bit of an anesthetic. It also, would help the baby to not feel it as much, not just because of its physical anesthetic properties.
Sure. And I think you do have to be careful if you're making any health claims about beer. But I do have a few more points from WebMD that I found. So it's been studied that beer can increase good cholesterol and contains vitamin B, both of which may lower the risk of heart disease. There's been a reduction seen in the risk of strokes specifically caused by a clot in the blood vessel, a reduction in the risk of death by heart attack, a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, a lower risk of death from any cause in people middle-aged or older, possible reduced risk of congestive heart failure in those 65 years old or older, and finally, a link with better general thinking ability in those aged late 70s and beyond. So, I think a lot more research has to be done, but those are all the good things I found. I'm not going to focus on the bad things in this episode.
Smart. Yeah, but I think it's the same with a lot of things, right? Everything in moderation. Everything's got its benefits and its perks. If you overdo it, well, then you're overdoing it, and don't expect to live longer just because you have 6 beers a day instead of 1.
What's the quote? Everything in moderation, including moderation.
Yeah, that one. I love it. Friends, do we have anything more that we want to touch on for magical brews?
I'm done.
Cool. Fabulous. Well, that was a lovely summary. So thank you, Christina. It's really interesting to see how, the different cultures across the world have really just focused on the same things, and through time, that's incredibly cool. Okay, friends. Well, then we're gonna call it a day, and we will see you for our next episode next week. And just one final reminder to please go on and subscribe to our various channels or to our social medias if you haven't, and share this podcast with a friend. If you enjoyed it, share it to someone you think will. That'd be great. Okay. Bye, everybody. Bye, friends.
Bye.
Concha, which means health.